Hey everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we'll be discussing about the gateway VPC endpoints. Now before we go ahead and discuss about the VPC endpoints in great detail, let's quickly understand the primary types of VPC endpoints that are available. So the first one is the gateway endpoints, then you have the interface endpoints, and then you also have the gateway load balancer endpoints, and each one of them has a specific use case. Now the primary aim of today's video is to go ahead and understand the gateway VPC endpoints. Now, in the gateway VPC endpoint based architecture, the traffic is routed from a specific EC2 instance to a supported destination service with the help of an appropriate route. So the subnet in which this EC2 instance lies, it needs to have a route table where there is a destination and the target is the VPC endpoint. Now, one of the question that comes is what exactly this destination implies. So at a high level overview, this destination is associated with a CIDR range. And this CIDR range that you see over here, it is associated with the destination service. So let's assume that you have a destination service of Amazon S3, then this CIDR range will be associated with that. And whenever a EC2 instance sends the traffic to this specific CIDR range, which is associated with S3, then the traffic is automatically routed to a VPC endpoint. And this is the basic architecture based on which the gateway VPC endpoint works. Now do note that gateway VPC endpoint only supports limited services. So you have a Amazon S3 that is supported and you have a DynamoDB which is supported. So with this basic set, let's go ahead and implement gateway VPC endpoints from scratch. So for today's video, we'll go ahead and select one of the regions where the default VPC is present, and we'll go ahead and create a gateway VPC endpoints. So within the search, let's go ahead and type VPC. Alright, so we have a default VPC that is available. The CIDR is 172.31.0016 and it will have multiple subnets associated with it. So now what we'll go ahead and do is we'll go ahead and assign one of the subnet as a VPC endpoint subnet, or you can just say it as a private subnet without a NAT gateway. So let's just call it as VPC endpoint subnet so that it is easily identifiable. Alright, and for this specific subnet, we'll also go ahead and create a new route table. So you have a default route. Let's create one more route table. Just call it as VPC endpoint route table, and we'll associate it with a default VPC. Let's create a route table. Alright, now at this stage you will see that you only have one route that is available. The target is local and the destination is 172.31.0016. So this specific route table will not allow communication to internet, both inwards as well as outwards. So now what we'll do is we'll associate this route table with the subnet. So we'll be associating it with the VPC subnet. That's great. So for our first part of today's architecture, what we have a VPC where there are certain subnets. These were a public subnet, among which we selected one subnet to make it as a private subnet, and we associated a new route so that the resources within the private subnet does not have any inbound or outbound internet connectivity. So now the next step is we'll go ahead and launch two EC2 instances, one in the public subnet and second one within our private subnet that we have created. So let's go ahead and go to the EC2 instance service. Now within the EC2 instance console, first thing let's go ahead and do for today's video is we'll go ahead and create a key pair. Alright, so this is a temporary key pair that we'll be creating. So let's just call it as temp key pair, and we'll create a file format of PEM here. Alright, so this key pair should be downloaded. Once done, let's go ahead and launch EC2 instances in this specific region. So we'll use the Amazon Linux 2 AMI. The instance type, just select the one associated with the free tier eligible. The subnet, make sure that you first select the VPC endpoint subnet, and we do not really need a IP, so we'll go ahead and disable the auto assign IP. Once done, let's do a review and launch, and we'll launch this with our key pair here. Alright, so let's go ahead and open this up, and let's just call it as private EC2. In a similar way, do note that since this EC2 does not have any communication both inbound and outbound towards the internet, will not be able to connect to it directly. So what we need for it to be connected is one more EC2 instance in a public subnet. So we'll first connect to this EC2 instance in public subnet, and from this EC2 instance, we'll go ahead and do an SSH to the private subnet EC2. Alright, so this is more if you have worked with the Bastion host based architecture, it's similar to that. So let's go ahead and launch one more instance in a public subnet this time. Make sure you select one of the subnets here. Let's use subnet 2A. We'll do a review and launch. We'll do a launch with our key pair. Perfect. So let's go ahead and call this as public EC2. That's great. One more thing that we have to do is we have to associate a IAM role, primarily because in today's practical, we want to ensure that the EC2 instance through the VPC endpoint is able to connect to the S3 bucket. So for this, we'll be making use of a IAM role. So let's go to the IAM service here. We'll go to role. Let's create a new role. The role use case would be EC2. And within the permission, let's just give it as S3 full access just for our testing purpose. And let's call it as VPC endpoint role. Alright, that's great. So now we'll go ahead and attach the role to both of the EC2 instance here. So let's quickly do that. Under security, I'll modify the role. And we have the VPC endpoint role. Let's associate with the first instance. And in a similar way, let's also go ahead and do it for the second instance. So I'll select the VPC endpoint role. We'll do a save. Perfect. So now we have our base architecture set. First, let's go ahead and connect to the EC2 instance via the public IP. Now from the SSH terminal, whichever SSH terminal you are using, you can just specify the temp key.pem, and let's go ahead and connect to the EC2 here. Alright, so we are connected to the EC2. So this is the public EC2 instance here. So from here, if I'll quickly do a AWS S3 LS, you see we are able to see a set of S3 buckets that are part of this specific AWS account. Now what we'll do is, since we want to connect from the public EC2 instance to the private EC2, we need to have a key pair associated with the private EC2. Now, since the key pair is in my local workstation, there are multiple approaches to take care of that, but we'll be using the simple one. I'll basically copy the private key over here. Let me copy the private key, and let's go ahead and create a new key here called as temp_key.pem. We'll paste the private key contents. Let's save this, and let's also change the permission to 400. All right. So now using this specific private key from the public EC2, let's go ahead and connect to the private EC2 instance via the private IP. Alright, let's do that. I'll do a yes, and perfect, we are connected. So since this EC2 already has a IAM role over here, if you go ahead and do a AWS S3 LS, and let's also specify a region, let's say US West 2. At this stage, you will not see any result, primarily because there is no connectivity towards the S3 that is available. Perfect. So our next step is to go ahead and create a gateway VPC endpoint. So let's go back to the VPC here, and let's go a bit down under the endpoints here. Let's create a new endpoint. And if you look here, there are multiple endpoints type. One is the interface endpoint. And if you'll go down a bit down, you'll also see a gateway endpoint here. So let's go ahead and filter by service. Now for the S3 service, you have both the interface as well as gateway endpoint. We are more interested in gateway endpoint for the time being, so we'll select that. And now the next part is to which route table this endpoint should be associated with. So this specific destination and target associated with the VPC endpoint needs to be associated with which of the route table. So we want it to be associated with our VPC endpoint route table. All right. Once done, let's go ahead and bit down. The policy will just leave it as it is for the time being. Let's go ahead and create an endpoint. Perfect. So let's do a close. And now you should see you have a VPC endpoint that is created. Now if you'll go to the route table, let's open up the VPC route table here. Let's go to the routes. And you should see you have one more route that is created, and this has a specific destination and the target is VPC endpoint. As we were discussing, this specific destination in turn is like a logical destination which has a CIDR range associated with the S3 service. Alright, so any traffic going to the S3 service will be targeted towards the VPC endpoint. So that is the basic idea here. So now, once this specific VPC endpoint is associated, let's go ahead and do a AWS S3LS once more, and you see it is working perfectly well. So from our private EC2, we are able to communicate with the S3 service. Great. So I hope with this you understood the basics of how the gateway VPC endpoint as well as the routing related to it works. Now let's go ahead and look into some of the downsides of gateway VPC endpoint. First among them is the overall architecture. So in this type of architecture, the actual VPC endpoint is not part of the VPC. It is outside of the VPC. So with the help of the route table, the traffic is directed towards the VPC endpoint. Now, since this VPC endpoint is not part of your VPC, it is not possible to use it directly from the VPNs or direct connect. So this is one important thing that you should know. Second important thing is that the endpoints are supported within the same region only. You cannot create an endpoint between a VPC and a service in a different region. This is very important part to remember. Now, if you'll just do a AWS S3LS from the private EC2, you see we are not getting any result over here. And this is the reason why we had explicitly specified a region over here. So this is the region where our EC2 is created. And if I press enter, you are able to see the buckets here. Now, one more important part to remember here is that you'll only be able to do operations on the bucket that is part of the same region. So although it is listing you all the buckets right now, but the operation will only work on the bucket that is part of the US West 2 region. So for example, let's say I'll do a AWS S3LS. Let's specify a bucket. Let's just call it as any bucket. So I'll just select a random bucket that is available. Let's press enter. As expected, you are not able to see anything. So in case if you'll even specify a region of US West 2, something similar to what we had done earlier, you see you are not able to see anything here, even though the EC2 instance has a full S3 permission available. Now, in order to also demonstrate this point in great detail, let me go ahead and create a bucket. So we'll be creating a new S3 bucket in the same region where this endpoint is created. So let's create a new bucket. Let's just call it as temp endpoint US West 2. You can just give any region. Make sure that the region is same as the region where the endpoint and the EC2 is present. We'll go ahead and leave everything as default. We'll go ahead and create a bucket. So now let's go ahead and do a AWS S3LS again. As expected, we are seeing this specific bucket. Let's copy this and let's do a AWS S3LS. Let's specify the bucket name and also let's specify the region of US West 2. And you see it is working perfectly well. Now, since this bucket does not have any contents, it basically did not show you anything. But in case if there is an image or whatever contents, it should show you the data. Now, in fact, let me also show you this so there is no doubt that arises in this specific video. So let me go ahead and add a random file. Alright, so I'll just simply add a PNG file. So this is a VPC PNG file. Now let's run the same command again. And you see, we are able to see the contents as expected. Great. So I hope this first point makes sense now. Second is that the endpoint supports IPv4 traffic only. And the third one is that you must turn on the DNS resolution in your VPC, or if you're using your own DNS server, ensure that the DNS requests to the required services such as S3 are resolved correctly to the IP address maintained by AWS. Now this is important primarily because the destination in your route table is associated with a specific CIDR. So if your DNS server is not giving you the resolution, so when you try to connect to the S3 endpoint and it is giving you a different IP address than the one that is part of this specific destination, then the overall routing will not work. And this is the reason why it is important to ensure that either you use a DNS resolution that is part of the VPC, or for your own DNS server, you have to ensure that the request is resolved correctly to the IP address that is maintained by AWS. That's great. So I hope with this you understood about the gateway VPC endpoint in great detail.